Fort Myers. There's lots of forts around here because of the history of the state and of the country. There's this fort, this Fort Wayne, fort this, fort that, because this was a new country where they had the army was everywhere. And that was true in Florida. You know, we had several wars, mini wars, but they were wars. They had Indian issues and whatever. So there's lots of forts in Fort Lauderdale, Fort Pierce on the East Coast. You can think about those. So there was Fort Myers. You could find out that it was fort named after Abraham Meyers. Now I'm saying now, Abraham Meyers. I said, that's interesting because it was probably, and it was easy enough to find, the fort was built a couple times because it burned once. It built originally in 1848 or something, or 1850. I knew there were no Jews in this area then because there were hardly any people, you know, who were not Seminoles. And so I researched it a little bit, and the internet in particular is very helpful now. I mean, you can Google Abraham Meyers and find out, but the local people just had no idea about that, and they didn't really care. Some research on it shows that very first, and one of the most interesting things, is he was never here. He never set foot in the area. He was stationed at Fort Brooke, and Fort Brooke is what is Tampa now, that area, and that was the headquarters for the Union Army, but it was before it was even called the Union Army, because in the 1840s or so, it was just the Army. And there were Indian problems that went on in Florida as the disgracefully treated the Indians. The United States was not good to the Indians, and particularly in Florida, because Florida changed hands country-wise. It used to be Spain that was in charge here, and the Indians, or as now known as Native Americans. Indian has become a bad word. Indians should come from India, and if they're not, then they're American, Native Americans, and they're the only natives in America. But they were all up north of here in Georgia and the Carolinas, and they were being pushed south because as the people of the United States settled, they would farm and ranch, and this encroached upon where the Native Americans lived. And there's a difference of philosophy also of the Native Americans of what is ownership. Ownership of the land is, we know ownership. You got a deed, you paid for it, you bought a piece of land. The American Indians or the American natives didn't look at it that way. It was everybody's land. The spiritual ancestors gave them the land or whatever. And so, you know, if you grew corn, they would come and take some for the winter so they could have it. And of course, the settlers didn't do well with that. They said, they're stealing it from us. And so that went on, and even it happened particularly with cattle, things like that, same kind of problems would come. And so the settlers would complain to their politicians, who would complain to Washington, who would tell the army, take care of that problem. Well, the way you took care of them is you pushed the Indians off and said, you need to go, there's nobody growing south of here. And they pushed them south. It got really bad in the Carolinas, where they pushed them to Oklahoma, because Oklahoma was going to be where all the Indians or the Native Americans should be in Oklahoma, and they forced them there. Well, but a whole bunch of them didn't go, and, you know, just ran away from the army and went south, and they were in Georgia for a while. Then they were pushed south again. and into North Florida. And then they were and they would always give them a piece of paper, say, oh, we're going to give you, and you're going to be the reservation, and it's yours, and we don't even, our laws don't even apply there. You govern yourself. And every time they did that, it never stood up. You could say they were lying to them, but that's not a nice way to say that. And so they kept pushing and pushing until they got to the Everglades. Then you couldn't push them anymore because you were running out of ground. So there were skirmishes about that still in this area, and particularly the river, the Caloosahatchee River was the main way of getting around, and so most of the settling that occurred along the river, and yet the Seminoles were the tribe, which is a different discussion, but and so that's the reason the general in Fort Brooke sent 100 troops down with a lieutenant, said, you're probably going to need to have an outpost down there because they're really bothering our settlers down there. And they did, and they found what was a good flat area, and it was good access to the river, and they built a wooden, not much of a fort at all, down there. And the general up there, daughter, who was a very pretty little 17-year-old, 18-year-old girl, had fallen in love with the colonel who was the quartermaster commander, which in the Army, the quartermaster is the person who is in charge of supplies for the Army. He's an Army colonel, but he makes sure that the Army has guns and uniforms and food, and that was his job. And his name happened to be Abraham Meyers. He was the colonel. And she fell in love with Abraham Meyers, and they were engaged. So the general told the lieutenant who was building the fort down here, I'd call that fort Fort Meyers, in the name of Abraham Meyers. And that's how it became Abraham Meyers. That fort burned down, but then there was some more trouble, and ended up as a civil war, and they really fortified it, and it was a real fort, and it was Abraham Meyers. He still had never been here. He had no reason to be here because he wasn't in command of the fort, and he had a terrific dilemma. He was from South Carolina. His father was a canner in Georgetown, South Carolina, which is right on the border of North and South Carolina on the coast. His grandfather was a rabbi in Charleston, South Carolina. So his family was Jewish, except for his new wife, who was not Jewish at all. And they didn't continue on with Judaism. He himself, it was not that important to him, and they raised their children Gentiles. But he had to choose whether he was going to be in the Confederacy, or the Union. He was a member of the Union Army automatically, because that's what he did. It was his career. He was a career officer. He chose to stay with the Confederacy. Became a general in the Confederacy, but got the worst job again because he was an expert at quartermaster. They made him the quartermaster general of the entire Confederacy, which was an absolute loser, because they said, you're in charge of all this now. Now you've got it. And they didn't give him any money. The Confederacy was always poor. That's probably, the experts of the Civil War will tell you that's why they lost the war. They were poor to begin with, compared to the industrial North. And secondly, there was an embargo. The North put their ships around and they cut off as much of the smuggling in that they could. And they cut down on their trade because their trade was cotton to go to Europe and all that. And so they were starving the South to death. And the guy who really caught the worst of it was they blamed it all on Meyers. He said because they had guys didn't have uniforms, they were always short of stuff. A small little side of thing, Fort Myers was a cattle town, and all of the Kissimmee area in the center part of the state was free range, and there was a lot of cattle. But these guys would 2 or 3 or 4 times a year round up the cattle, they were cowboys, and run that cattle down through Fort Myers down to what is now Punta Rasa, which is right at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River, put them on barges and run it to Cuba. Cuba bought all their meat from here. And so but most of those cowboys and all those guys doing in the cattle business were Southerners. And the first time when Meyers would send his people to buy cattle for meat for his troops, the locals and the cowboys from Kissimmee sold it to the Confederate Army. That was their logical thing to do. They got paid in Confederate money, which ended up to be not worth anything. They knew that when they sold cattle to Cuba, which was Spain, they got paid in gold. And so that was the end of that thing. They didn't sell it to the Confederacy anymore. So that just a typical thing of the problems that Abraham Meyers had. And when the war ended, he was so distraught of being blamed for all of this that he left this country and moved to Germany with his family, his whole family, and did not come back to the United States for 11 years. And then finally came back to the United States, and everybody probably forgot about him, and they didn't hate him anymore. But his son, whose I believe's name was Jack Meyers, went in the military, and I believe he went to the Naval Academy, Annapolis, and became an officer, but in the Marines, because the Marines part of the Navy. And he worked his way all the way up and became a general himself, and became famous for some battles and fighting that went on in the Philippines. The United States had fought over there. That's how we ended up, for a while we had the Philippines from the Spain. That was part of that Spanish-American War that didn't go well for Spain. We had it, and then we made them independent, the Philippines. But Jack Meyers became very famous in the military history, but not too many people read the military history other than the military. But that's the history of Abraham Meyers. And nobody talked much about him. His picture would be on the wall in the courthouse, Colonel Abraham Meyers. But I would talk to people about it. And Abraham Meyers says, "Did you know he was Jewish?" And I get this blank look from the mayor. The mayor says, "You're kidding me." I said, "No, why would I kid you?" I said, "And look it up here. In fact, I'll give him a website to look it up on the internet." But he's mentioned there's a history museum here that one of his relatives was Jewish or something. It's a very vague kind of thing. They don't give a lot of credit to it because they're wondering, how did that happen? How did the Jewish guy, become the founder of this town that's a very prosperous, big, this Southwest Florida is becoming a very important part of Florida right now, and probably the quickest growing. But that's the story of Abraham Meyers.